Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. It was New Year's Eve, and I was driving to visit an old friend who lived in this tiny town in Texas. I'd planned to stay for a couple of days to catch up, watch the fireworks, and just enjoy the holiday. The thing is, I'd worked late that day, and by the time I left, it was already dark. My friend's place was about a 4-hour drive from where I lived, and I figured I'd get there a little after midnight. Not ideal, but I'd done night drives before. No big deal, right? I hadn't seen another car for at least an hour, and my phone signal was pretty much gone. That's when I started to feel uneasy. It's hard to explain, but you know that feeling you get when something just doesn't feel right? Yeah, that. 11:30 p.m., I was maybe 30 minutes from my friend's town when my car suddenly jerked forward and then slowed down. I pulled over and turned on my hazard lights. At first, I thought I'd just hit a pothole or something, but when I tried to drive again, the car wouldn't budge. It was like the engine just gave up. My God, that was way too loud. My phone started blinking, then I got out to take a look, even though I had no idea what I was looking for. I mean, I'm not a car person. I checked the tires. They seemed fine. Popped the hood and stared at the engine like it was going to tell me what was wrong. It was useless. My car was dead, and I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. I'll admit, I started to panic a little. My phone had no signal, probably miles away. I thought about walking, but the road was pitch black, and the idea of wandering around in the dark didn't seem smart. So I got back in the car, locked the doors, and decided to wait. Maybe another car would come by, or my phone would pick up a signal eventually. About 20 minutes passed, and I was starting to get really cold. Then, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. A truck was coming up the road, and I felt this huge wave of relief. Finally, someone who could help. The truck slowed down as it got closer, and then it pulled over behind me. A man got out, and I could see him walking toward my car. He was tall, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing a baseball cap and a flannel jacket. He seemed normal enough, but something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was just me being paranoid. He knocked on my window, and I rolled it down just a crack. "Car trouble?" he asked. His voice was deep, but not unfriendly. I explained what happened, and he nodded. "Pop the hood," he said. "Let me take a look." I hesitated, but figured I didn't have much of a choice. He seemed like he knew what he was doing, so I got out and showed him the engine. He poked around for a bit, muttering to himself, and then stood up straight. "Your alternator's shot," he said. "You're not going anywhere tonight." I asked if he could help me get to the nearest town, and he said, "Sure, I can give you a ride. My truck's just back there." Here's the thing. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to go with him. But what choice did I have? It was either that or spend the night freezing in my car, hoping someone else would come along. So, against my better judgment, I grabbed my bag and followed him to his truck. The truck was old, with a bunch of tools and junk piled in the back. He opened the passenger door for me, and I climbed in. As we started driving, he tried to make small talk, asking me where I was headed and stuff like that. I answered, but I kept my responses short. Something about him just felt off. After about 10 minutes, I noticed we weren't heading toward any town. The road was getting narrower, and the trees were thicker. I asked him where we were going, and he said he knew a shortcut. My stomach dropped. This wasn't right. I told him I'd changed my mind and wanted to go back to my car, but he just laughed. "Relax," he said. "We'll be there soon." At this point, I was freaking out. I reached for my phone, even though I knew it didn't have a signal. That's when I noticed something on the floor of the truck. It was a roll of duct tape and a pair of zip ties. My heart started pounding. I didn't know what to do. If I tried to jump out, he'd probably stop me. If I stayed, who knows what would happen. Before I could decide, we passed a sign for a rest area up ahead. I told him I needed to use the restroom and asked if we could stop. He seemed annoyed but agreed. As soon as the truck slowed down, I unbuckled my seatbelt, grabbed my bag, and bolted. I didn't even look back. I just ran toward the rest area, hoping someone would be there. Luckily, there was a family parked there, getting snacks from a vending machine. I ran up to them, out of breath, and quickly explained what had happened. As I was talking, I instinctively checked my own phone and realized I had a signal again at this spot. Without wasting a second, I called the police. The family stayed with me while I made the call, and they even offered me some water to help me calm down. By the time the cops arrived, the man and his truck were already gone. Here's the part that still gives me chills. A few days later, I got a call from the police. They'd arrested the guy. Turns out, he'd kidnapped someone else that same night, not far from where my car broke down. The victim managed to escape, and that's how they caught him. When I think about what could have happened if I hadn't run, it makes my skin crawl. To this day, I can't drive that road again without feeling a chill down my spine. If you're ever driving through the empty roads of rural Texas, be careful who you trust, because not everyone who offers help has your best interests at heart. It all started with a simple idea: spending New Year's Eve reconnecting with old friends from college. We decided to meet up at an old friend's family ranch in Texas, about a 2-hour drive from Dallas. The place was vast, isolated, and bordered by dense woods that stretched for miles. I'd known most of these people since college, but we hadn't all been together in years. Life got busy, you know. So, when Jake suggested the party at his family's ranch, everyone jumped on the idea. I'll be honest, the drive out there already had me second-guessing. The road just seemed to stretch on forever, and the towns got smaller and farther apart the closer I got. It was one of those long, 2-lane highways with barely any streetlights, and by the time I made it to the ranch, it was pitch black outside. Jake was waiting out front when I pulled up, waving me in with a flashlight. The ranch house was bigger than I expected, but it had this old, weathered look to it. White paint peeling off the walls and a sagging porch. Still, it had this cozy vibe, with lights strung up around the porch and a bonfire crackling out back. Inside it was warm and loud. The place smelled like wood smoke and something sweet, maybe cider. Everyone was already there. Kayla and Matt, who are married now, Steph, who I hadn't seen since graduation, and a couple of Jake's other friends I didn't know too well. We all hugged, laughed, and started catching up. Around 11, Jake mentioned this hill about half a mile from the ranch. He said it had a killer view of the stars and suggested we head out there around midnight to watch the fireworks. Everyone thought it was a great idea, so we bundled up. Texas winters aren't brutal, but it was still cold. And grabbed flashlights. I remember thinking the hike was a little eerie. The moon was bright enough to light up the path, but the trees around us cast long, dark shadows. We joked around to lighten the mood, but the deeper we went, the quieter it got. Even the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, owls, seemed muted. When we got to the hill, Jake was right. You could see everything from up there. The ranch house way off in the distance, miles of open fields, and the stars scattered across the sky. It was beautiful and kind of surreal. We stayed for maybe half an hour, watching fireworks in the distance and laughing about stupid memories from college. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen Steph in a while. She'd been standing next to me earlier, but now she was nowhere to be found. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured Steph had wandered off to take a picture or something. She was always posting artsy stuff on Instagram. "Hey, where's Steph?" I asked, looking around. Everyone sort of paused and glanced at each other. Jake frowned. "I thought she was with you." "Nope," I said. "She was here like 5 minutes ago, though. Maybe she went back to the ranch," Kayla said, shrugging. That made sense. It was cold and Steph had been complaining earlier about forgetting her gloves. Still, something about it didn't sit right with me. I pulled out my phone to text her, but of course there was no signal. Figures, right? Middle of nowhere. Jake shone his flashlight toward the path we'd come up. "We should probably head back anyway. It's getting late." We all started down the hill, sticking closer together this time. Jake led the way, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see Steph trailing behind us, but she didn't. When we got back to the ranch, the first thing we did was check inside. The lights were still on, the fire in the fireplace was burning low, and her jacket was draped over one of the chairs. "Steph?" Jake called out. No answer. We checked every room, even the bathroom, but she wasn't there. "Okay, this is weird," Matt said, rubbing the back of his neck. "She wouldn't just leave," Kayla added. Jake was quiet for a moment, then said, "She might have gone back up the hill. Maybe she dropped something, or I don't know." "Should we go look?" I asked. He nodded. "Yeah, let's go. You guys stay here," he told Kayla and Matt, "in case she comes back." The three of us, me, Jake, and one of his other friends, Ryan, grabbed our flashlights and headed back out. The air felt colder this time, and the quiet was even more oppressive. We called out Steph's name over and over, but the only response was the crunch of our boots on the dirt trail. By the time we got back to the hill, my stomach was in knots. "She's not here," Ryan said, shining his flashlight around. "Wait," Jake said, pointing to something on the ground. It was Steph's phone. The screen was cracked, and it looked like it had been there for a while. "Okay, this is officially freaking me out," I said, my voice shaking. Jake picked up the phone, his face pale. She wouldn't just leave this behind. We searched the area for another hour, yelling her name and shining our flashlights in every direction. Nothing. Not a single trace of her. Eventually, we had to go back to the ranch and call the police. Matt and Kayla were already panicked when we got there, and the rest of the night was a blur of officers asking questions, shining their own flashlights around the property, and telling us to stay put. "Hi," Meredith said, standing beside him on the back porch. "Margun," she said. "Royal Starks and I were made to be a part of the campaign to save the establishment. The police stayed until sunrise. They scoured the hill, the trail, the ranch, everywhere they could think of. A few of us tried to stay awake, hoping for news, but by 5 a.m., exhaustion took over. I passed out on the couch in the living room, but it was a restless sleep, filled with fragmented dreams of walking through endless fields, calling out Steph's name, When I woke up, the sun was streaming through the windows, and the house felt eerily quiet. Jake was sitting at the dining table, staring at his hands. Kayla and Matt were huddled on the couch, whispering to each other. "Anything?" I asked, my voice groggy. Jake shook his head. "They're still looking." The rest of the morning dragged on like molasses. A couple of the officers came back around noon to ask more questions, but they didn't tell us much. "We'll keep you updated," was all they said, before heading back out. By the afternoon, most of us decided to leave. I didn't want to, but what else could we do? Jake stayed behind to wait for more updates, but the rest of us packed up and drove back to our lives, unsure of what to think or feel. A week later, Steph was found. She'd been discovered by a rancher about 5 miles from Jake's property, wandering along a dirt road in the same clothes she'd been wearing that night. According to him, she looked dazed and confused, but otherwise unharmed. We were all relieved, of course, but when I heard the news, I couldn't shake this creeping unease. What was she doing out there for a whole week? Why hadn't she come back sooner? I didn't get to talk to her right away. Her family took her to a hospital, and they kept things pretty private. But eventually I got a call from Jake, saying Steph wanted to see a few of us. When I got to her place, she seemed different. Not in a bad way, exactly, but she wasn't the Steph I remembered. She was quieter, more cautious, like she was always looking over her shoulder. We sat in our living room, sipping coffee and making awkward small talk until I finally asked, "What happened that night?" Steph stared down at her mug for a long time before answering. "I don't know," she said finally. "I remember being on the hill with you guys. I thought I saw something, off in the distance, past the trees. It looked like a light, maybe a lantern or something. I thought it was weird, so I walked a little closer to get a better look." She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "And then?" I prompted. "That's just it," she said, shaking her head. "I don't know. Everything after that is a blur. I remember falling, maybe hitting my head, and then nothing. The next thing I knew, I was walking along that road, and that man found me. I didn't know what to say. None of us did." Steph swore up and down that she didn't see or hear anyone else that night, but something about her story didn't sit right with me. What light had she seen? And how had she ended up 5 miles away without any memory of getting there? To this day, none of us have any answers. Steph doesn't talk about it anymore, and the rest of us have kind of stopped asking. But every time New Year's Eve rolls around, I think about that hill, that night, and the light Steph said she saw. Sometimes I wonder if we should have just stayed inside by the fire. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.